27 Japanese bombers which raided Darwin were escorted by 15 fighters. They rained bombs on the north coast Australian town, apparently annoyed at the failure of their attacks by sea. The Battle of the Coral Sea badly upset their plans. Every Australian is determined that this further violation of the soil of his homeland shall be repaid time and time again until the Japs scream for mercy, and then they'll get justice.
Hello podcasters, welcome to Living History, and I should start by saying how great are those old newsreel accounts of the Second World War. I just can't get enough of them. Absolutely fantastic. Today, a very special episode. It's the anniversary of the bombing of Darwin. 76 years ago today, Japanese bombers appeared on the horizon and caused incredible destruction on the town of Darwin. Hundreds of people were killed. It was the first and by far the biggest attack that Australia has ever suffered, and it was really a shock to the Australian people. So we're going to delve into that today. We're going to look at why that attack occurred, what the Japanese were hoping to achieve, and what the ramifications were of the attack on Darwin. A bit of a special episode. I hope you enjoy it. Let's get stuck in.
A date which will live in infamy.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Well may we say, God save the Queen, because nothing will save the Governor General.
There's a second plane just crashed into the World Trade Center. I think we have a terrorist attack.
This was their finest hour.
So the attack on Darwin, I think it's important not to look at it in isolation. This was part of a very long story about the Pacific War, about what the Japanese were trying to achieve, about what the Allies were trying to do to defend against them. So let's cast our minds back slightly. Let's go back to late 1941 and the very opening days of early 1942. What were the Japanese trying to achieve in the Pacific? Obviously, the most famous action that occurred at this time was in December when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, bringing America into the war. But what exactly were the Japanese trying to do in the Pacific at this time? The answer is all about resources. Japanese, although a very strong military nation in the 1940s, was very resource poor. It had to import all of its oil, all of its rubber, all the resources it needed to wage war. It needed to import from other countries overseas. And Japan had realized in the 1930s that this was a terrible idea. And so their plan with all these invasions and all this land that they were grabbing in the 1940s was to give themselves resources, and places like the Dutch East Indies, today's Indonesia, would be very important in that for them, in securing resources and being self-sufficient and not relying on other countries for their resources. So that was the reason Japan spread this empire throughout Asia. The reason they were in the Pacific as well was to defend that empire. They planned to produce this huge empire, which they called a co-prosperity sphere. They referred to the empire as. They had this huge Asian empire, and the idea was they would capture islands in the Pacific, they would fortify them, put airfields on them to defend these gains they'd made in Southeast Asia. So that was the situation by early 1942, and the Japanese had been very successful in their advance through Asia, and it had brought them all the way to the Dutch East Indies, as I said, today's Indonesia. In particular, the next step in Japanese plans, once they'd captured the Dutch East Indies, were the islands of Timor and Java in early 1942. So these were really the final steps that Japan were planning to make in this area to secure the resource-rich Dutch East Indies. Facing Timor and Java was the town of Darwin. Now, Darwin in 1942 was very small compared to today. There was probably only about 5,000 people living there. It was very much a town. But what it was in a very important strategic position. It was right at the top of Australia. It was a major Allied naval and air base, and was going to be used to counterattack against the Japanese as they advanced through Asia. The Japanese knew this, and so they made the decision that they were going to try and knock Darwin out. They were going to reduce its effectiveness as an air base, and they were going to try and knock it out of the war. So the Japanese planned that as part of that those actions in Timor and Java, they would attack Darwin to remove it as a threat against their advance. So we often misunderstand it. This is a crucial point about the attack on Darwin. We often think that this was the first steps in a Japanese invasion of Australia, that this was the first point the Japanese landed and that they were going to march southwards across Australia and capture Australia. That wasn't the case. This was simply to eliminate a really important Allied naval and air base that was right on the doorstep of Japan's invasion plans in Asia. So fast forward to February 1942. Japan decides we're going to attack Darwin. Now, the interesting thing about this is the ships that they sent, the aircraft carriers they sent to attack Darwin, had been used at Pearl Harbor only a couple of months earlier. So 4 of the aircraft carriers that had attacked at Pearl Harbor were now redeployed to Darwin for this attack. So it's why we often think of Darwin and we often refer to it as Australia's Pearl Harbor, because there are a huge number of similarities. So on the 19th of February 1942, the Japanese attack Darwin. They took off from these aircraft carriers about 8:30 in the morning, and they flew towards Darwin. Now, the first raid was pretty big. So these 4 aircraft carriers launched 152 bombers, which were escorted by 36 Zero fighters to protect them. And they were attacking a town that was not prepared at all for this sort of attack. Darwin, even though it was so important to the Allies, was very poorly defended. It didn't have a very good air defense network of aircraft. The anti-aircraft guns there were not very efficiently placed. They just didn't have enough resources to fight against an air attack of this size. So if you imagine nearly 200 planes taking off from these aircraft carriers and streaking towards Darwin. At 9:35 a.m., a missionary, Father John McGrath, was on Bathurst Island, and he looked up and he saw all these planes flying overhead and heading south. So he immediately recognised the danger. He got on his radio, he radioed Darwin and said, "Look out, there's a big force of planes heading your way." But no alarm was raised in Darwin. And the reason? The authorities in Darwin mistakenly assumed this was a group of American planes that were due to arrive that day. A terrible coincidence, which no doubt cost many dozens of lives. Because by the time these aircraft arrived over Darwin just before 10 a.m, no alarm had been sounded. The alarm was only sounded as the bombs began to fall on Darwin. So this was the first wave that came over Darwin, and they attacked the harbour. They were aiming for shipping. They attacked the army barracks in the town and the airfield. But their number one target was Allied ships that were in Darwin Harbour. So the Americans had ships there, the Australians had ships there, the Dutch had ships, there were ships from the Philippines. The harbour was absolutely packed with both warships and merchant ships as well, which were essential in maintaining supply lines throughout the entire area. So the bombers came in, dive bombers, torpedo bombers that had been launched from the aircraft carriers, very similar to the attack on Pearl Harbor. They flew in low, they dropped bombs, and in about 20 minutes, no time at all, they'd sunk 9 ships in Darwin Harbour, and that was simply because there were no adequate defences against this sort of attack. They'd also attacked the airfield, where they destroyed dozens of planes. It was a huge disaster. They'd attacked the oil storage depots, where all of the Allied oil was stored for the shipping and the planes. The oil depots were on fire. Planes were destroyed on the ground. Ships were sunk. Darwin was burning, and it was, as you can imagine, horrific for the people there. Soldiers had been running out and firing at these planes as they came over with their rifles. Civilians were panicking and running through the streets. Just a really horrific and a very short period of time as well. This destruction occurred in less than half an hour. During this whole period, a couple of planes managed to get airborne from the Air Force Base, but there was really nothing that we could do to defend against this incredible and this surprise attack. And the Japanese only lost 5 aircraft in the whole attack. The planes disappeared over the horizon. They rendezvoused with their aircraft carriers, and the ships steamed away. And as far as the people of Darwin were concerned, it was a terrible sight. The town was burning. There were people killed and wounded. Just a horrific time. But the horror was not yet over for them, because at midday, a second wave of Japanese planes came in. Now, these were high-level bombers. These had been launched from air bases up in the Dutch East Indies. These flew over, and their targets were the Air Force Base in the town. Now, because these were high-level bombers, they dropped their bombs from very high altitude, and they were quite inaccurate. They managed to destroy a lot of planes on the ground. They caused a lot of damage to the Air Force Base, but they also dropped bombs over the main township of Darwin as well. So a lot of civilians were killed in this raid when bombs came raining down on them. Most famously, the post office in Darwin was hit, and the postmaster and his entire family were killed. Absolutely tragic, but a lot of people within the town of Darwin lost their lives in that second raid. Once again, the defences were quite inadequate against this second Japanese raid. The anti-aircraft guns fired at the planes as they came over, but they had ineffective fuses, and their shells would not detonate at the altitude the planes were flying. So the Japanese bombers were basically unmolested in their attack on Darwin, and lots of people were killed as a result of that. One of the interesting stories about the Japanese losses that occurred during this day was one of the planes from the first raid was a Zero fighter. And it was piloted by a man by the name of Hajime Toyoshima. Now, Toyoshima is an interesting character. His plane was actually hit. It didn't suffer much damage, but it suffered a couple of crucial bullet holes, possibly even from small arms fire, from individuals firing rifles and small machine guns at the plane as it flew over. But he suffered a hole in his engine, which was causing him all sorts of oil pressure problems, and he realised he couldn't fly back to the aircraft carrier. He couldn't make it back. So he crash landed on Melville Island, just north of Darwin, and abandoned his plane and ran off through the bush. Was pretty quickly captured and became the first Japanese prisoner of war in Australian hands. Now, his story doesn't end there, because he was then sent to the prisoner of war camp in Cowra in New South Wales. And Toyoshima was one of the instigators of the very famous Cowra breakout, which took place in 1944, when the Japanese threw themselves at the barbed wire in Cowra and escaped from the prison, and many hundreds of them were killed in that breakout, and some Australian guards were killed as well. So a very dramatic footnote to this story was that one of the men who was the instigator of the Cowra breakout was captured when his plane was shot down in that first raid on Darwin. So what's the situation like now, late in the morning, in the early afternoon on the 19th of February 1942? The town is on fire. 9 ships have been sunk in the harbour. Many more have been damaged. The airfield is on fire. The army barracks is damaged. The town itself is burning. Lots of buildings have been knocked down. Hundreds of civilians have been killed. An absolute scene of just devastation across Darwin. And things went from bad to worse, because the military then issued an order to the Air Force personnel and the Army personnel that were there, saying, let's regroup, let's head inland, let's regroup, we'll get you some food, we'll get sorted out, and then we can come back and help with the rescue efforts. But as soon as people began to leave, as soon as the military started to leave, as soon as they received these orders to leave the town, it turned to chaos. And I must say that men probably keen to hear an order to evacuate thought it was an order to evacuate, and they started leaving the town in large numbers. There was also rumours that this was a prelude to a Japanese invasion, that there were Japanese troops on their way that were going to occupy the town, and it spread to panic among the military forces. And it's a bit of a sad chapter of this story, is that the military did abandon their posts in large numbers and fled inland. I mean, we don't want to give them too much of a hard time. It was a very horrific time. The orders were very garbled. They were poorly issued and difficult to understand. But it is true that many hundreds of Air Force and Army personnel who could have been helping in the rescue efforts fled the town and moved inland. Looting was also a big problem. And these are the things we don't often hear about with these raids. Looting was a huge problem in Darwin, both from civilians and military personnel, basically taking advantage of the disorder that had come from the attack to loot belongings from private houses and businesses. Even Government House wasn't spared. The administrator's piano was looted in the days after the raid and was never seen again. So again, these are the things we should remember about this, though. We shouldn't gloss over them. We should say that people were distressed, people were in a terrible situation, and unfortunately, the worst of human nature comes out as well as the great side of human nature. For everyone that was rescuing and helping people, also you had a small number of people doing the wrong thing, and desertion and looting was a problem in Darwin after these attacks. What were the results of the attack on Darwin? The casualties, probably somewhere in the vicinity of 250 to 300 people were killed, both military and civilian. A shocking number of people, such a huge number of people that were killed. Some reports more recently have said that maybe up to 1,000 or even over 1,000 people were killed. That seems far too high. Most historians, myself included, don't really agree with that figure. The records, as best we can tell, put it at a maximum of about 300. But that's a lot of people, particularly considering the town only had a population of about 5,000. That's a huge number of people, both military and, unfortunately, a very large number of civilians that were killed in the raid as well. So you imagine what it was like for people. Shocking to hear about this attack on Darwin throughout the rest of Australia. It's often referred to today as Australia's Pearl Harbor, and there are a lot of similarities there. The ships that were used, the aircraft carriers that were used at Pearl Harbor, were also used in Darwin. In actual fact, the Japanese dropped more tonnage of bombs on Darwin than they dropped on Pearl Harbor, which is an incredible statistic. They dropped more bombs and more torpedoes at Darwin than they did at Pearl Harbor. Of course, the casualties were nowhere similar. More than 2,000 people were killed at Pearl Harbor, just because of the huge number of capital ships that were at Pearl Harbor, and the loss of the Arizona, where more than 1,000 people were killed at Pearl Harbor. But still, it's incredible to think that there were so many parallels between Pearl Harbor and the attack on Darwin, and the 300-odd people killed in Darwin was certainly a shocking figure. The attack on Darwin is remembered today as the first and the most important and the largest of more than 60 raids that occurred on northern Australia throughout the war. And it really is an iconic moment in Australia's military history. Imagine the terror that people experienced when either the people in Darwin, obviously, who had to live through this horrific raid, but also the people in the rest of Australia who didn't know what was going on. They didn't know if this was the start of a Japanese invasion. It's interesting how we look back on Darwin today, because there are a couple of myths that have really sprung up about it. And that's the most important one. The one I just touched on is it's important to remember this was not a prelude to a Japanese invasion. The Japanese had a very specific tactical aim, which was to eliminate a threat to their operations in the Dutch East Indies. So Darwin was a major base. It was right on the doorstep of land now occupied by the Japanese, and they simply wanted to eliminate it as a threat. So that was the reason for the attack on Darwin. They wanted to sink those ships. They wanted to destroy those aircraft. They wanted to destroy the airfield if they could, so that the Allies could not use that to counterattack the Japanese in the Dutch East Indies. And they were actually pretty successful in that, because Darwin Harbour, although it was used throughout the war, was never again packed with ships like it had been on that first day. Less aircraft then came through Darwin. A lot of the operations were moved inland so that they were out of the range of Japanese bombers. So the Japanese were actually quite effective in that aim to minimise the usefulness of Darwin as a base for the Allies. The other thing that comes out, which I think is interesting, is this idea that there was a big cover-up about the invasion, about the attack, that the government and the media were concerned that panic would spread, so covered up the attack. And I haven't really seen much evidence of that, because even just in my research for today's podcast, I was going back through the archives. There was a lot of accounting about this. There was a lot of reporting about the attack on Darwin that came out in the days immediately after the attack. There was even a front page article where John Curtin, the Prime Minister, was quoted as saying that damage to property was considerable and a severe blow has been struck on Australian soil. So there was widespread reporting about this attack across Australia in the days immediately afterwards. So I think this idea that there was a cover-up or that censorship led to people not really knowing about it simply wasn't true. In addition to that, you had thousands of people who fled Darwin because of the fear of another Japanese attack. And they came south. They went to Adelaide, they went to Melbourne, they went to Sydney, and they came with reports of the Japanese attacking Darwin. So it's always very difficult to cover up an account of such a large attack. People are going to talk about it. It's very, very difficult to cover up something like that. And I think it's fair to say the people of Australia did know very well that the Japanese had attacked Darwin, and a lot of people had been killed. And I think that's the most important point now to remember about it. Just imagine what it was like in early 1942. Singapore had only fallen a week before this attack on Darwin, just a week earlier. And then only a couple of months later, the Japanese sent midget submarines into Sydney Harbour. I mean, every day they were getting reports about another loss and another Japanese attack. The Japanese in early 1942 seemed absolutely unstoppable. And it was a fair assumption that people made that the next target on the Japanese radar was Australia. So we now know it's not true. We now know that the Japanese had no intention of actually landing in Australia and occupying Australia. But I tell you what, it didn't feel like that at the time. In early 1942, it seemed like the Japanese were going to be on our doorstep at any minute, and it must have been just a horrific time. Some of the darkest days Australia has ever experienced. Australia felt incredibly alone. America was a very long way away. The British were preoccupied with the Nazis and the fighting in North Africa. The British had suffered these huge blows in Asia and were pulling out in massive numbers. Australia was isolated, alone, and very frightened. Just an amazing time in our history to think about what it was like for Australian people at that time. And today we look back on the attack on Darwin, and we remember it as one of the most important chapters of our Second World War history. There's memorials up in Darwin to ships that were lost and people that were killed in the raid. You can still find battle damage up there. I was up there a few years ago filming a documentary, and one of the historians there took me and showed me fences with bullet holes in them being strafed from Japanese Zeros in 1942. So there's still battle damage you can find on the buildings up there. The most important site to visit up there in Darwin is the Adelaide River War Cemetery, where all the victims of the bombings were buried. And originally even some Japanese were buried up there as well. Japanese airmen who'd been shot down were originally buried up in Darwin as well, but they were moved in the 60s to Cowra in New South Wales, where now all the Japanese who were killed on Australian soil are now buried in Cowra in New South Wales. So there's a lot to see up in Darwin. It is a really interesting site. It's a bit of an unexpected chapter of our war history when you head up to Darwin. It's not why people go up to Darwin. They don't generally go up there to do military history, but when they're up there, they find that there's some fascinating sites to see, and we lead tours up there several times a year to go and explore those sites. It's also, I mentioned Cowra a couple of times as well. Cowra is also a fantastic site to visit in regional New South Wales if you're interested in this chapter of history, because all of the Japanese who were killed both in the Cowra breakout and also the ones that were killed in air raids over Darwin are now buried there at Cowra. And we visit Cowra as part of our Australia in World War II tour. So if you're interested in seeing Darwin or Cowra, give us a call. We can certainly arrange a tour for you up there. Well, that's the podcast for today. I hope you enjoyed that account of the bombing of Darwin, a really important date to remember, the 19th of February 1942. So I hope you all pause and remember those men and women who were killed in this first and by far the largest attack on Australia during the Second World War.